Apothecary Podcast. Authentic chat about medicines, pharmacy and healthcare in the UK.
Pharmacists Jamie, Gimmo and STC take on topical and controversial stories but keep it edgy yet light-hearted.
Pod guests share their desert island drugs and joyful patient stories.
Welcome to the Oral Apothecary Podcast. My name is Jamie Hayes. For our final episode of Series 3, we're joined by Dr Pete Turton. Pete is currently training in both anaesthesia and intensive care medicine. We will welcome Pete in a moment as he shares his desert island drug, his career anthem, and recommends a book for the Oral Apothecary Library. Our micro discussion this week is informed by the National Poisons Information Service report as we look at poisonings and admissions to intensive care. Every day in the UK, hundreds of people present to frontline NHS healthcare professionals because of 1. Accidental contact with substances found in households or gardens, 2. Drug overdoses in the context of self-harm or as a result of drug misuse, and 3. Natural toxins such as snake bites. But first, let me welcome my two fellow apothecaries. STC is in Bournemouth and Gimmo is in Cardiff. Welcome both. What have you been up to?
Evening.
Tore my cartilage, found out that's what the pain I've been having for the last couple of weeks is. So I've been on the ibuprofen. Not much else been happening really. We've been getting ready for the live event, which will have happened by the time this one goes out. And I've been battening down the trampoline because it's Storm Eunice is coming to Cardiff tomorrow. And we're looking at 100-mile-an-hour winds coming in. So that's been on my mind today.
Is the torn cartilage as a result of that triathlon thing you did?
It's probably all linked. It's a combination of being 49, running, being overweight, and, not being very athletic.
All of the above.
Sounds like one of my consultations.
It is, yeah.
And what a poor effort. Here you are, an apothecary, and all you can manage is ibuprofen. I mean, surely you've got some codeine stashed somewhere.
No comment.
Okay. So I was a little bit grumpy last week, wasn't I, about the DTB? So I'm going to go positive this week and say that I've had some good positive experiences reviewing other people's prescribing. So within the PCN, we've got a medical GP registrar, and we've also got quite a lot of AMPs, some of whom are relatively new and have only recently started prescribing. So both of them asked me to review some of their prescribing, and it was a great experience because you remember yourselves when you first get that, a pen as it was, it's electronic now. But when you first get that pen, all of a sudden it feels very different, doesn't it, compared to... Of course, you two have never prescribed, so you don't know what I'm talking about. But Pete will. Although maybe it's different for a junior doctor. You've done the course. You could prescribe everything in the BNF, can't you? Straight off, no problem. But for these guys, they wanted some feedback about, what they were doing well and how they could improve. So it was a very uplifting experience, and very impressed about the way that they go about it. And we talked a lot about keeping good notes, as we've talked about before on here, and medico-legally, not trying to be defensive, but just saying that if you've got good notes, and you know what, this whole thing about, I saw it today actually in someone else's notes, I discussed this case at the coffee room meeting and we all agreed that this was the best course of action. So that chimes really beautifully with what Stephen was telling us about a couple of episodes ago. So yeah, positive stuff for me this week. What about you, James?
A couple of things caught my eye related to previous discussions. One of them was, sad case from the coroner preventing future deaths on that communication error in the patient admitted with a tonic-clonic seizure, the 15 mg per kilogram of phenytoin that was mistaken and written as 50 milligrams per kilo. And so that was, a desperate case really, and again, something that we've touched on in previous episodes. And then the other paper that I saw in the news this week that was all over social media, and rightly so, was the pharmaceutical pollution of the world's rivers.
We were ahead of them.
The global scale study of 258 of the world's rivers. And an essential read. Not the easiest of things to read, but the headline figures are, look, active pharmaceutical ingredients in the river systems of the world: carbamazepine, stormin, metformin, and caffeine were the three that were flagging highly. But the data that they have is fascinating.
Yep, we have covered that before. You're absolutely right. Not just thrown together. So, very excited. This is the last episode of Series 3. Who knows if we'll be back for Series 4. But we thought we'd take a slight left turn for the last episode. And so it's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Pete Turton, who, if any of you are following Med Twitter, he's a bit of a legend. He actually got 2 accounts. That's how good he is. And he will perhaps explain himself about his venture into the social media. And he's very open about, it's a parody and it's about some irony, but also some truth as a proper jobbing junior / almost senior doctor. But for the serious point, he's currently training both jointly, and this is no mean feat, to do both intensive care and anaesthesia. He works in the Mersey region. We can't, for legal purposes, explain where he currently works. I'm only joking. And we were first brought to Pete's attention by the Placemat. And those who have listened to us for a while will know that we've often talked about how much we enjoy the Placemat as a podcast. And Pete does the humour in relation to that. So it's a great pleasure to invite you on to the Oral Apothecary, Pete.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here. Thanks for thinking of me.
It feels a bit like you're a clownfish, doesn't it?
There's a great pressure to be sort of absolutely hilarious for the next sort of 20 minutes, and then you realise I'm horribly dull in real life.
Well, that's true for all of us, isn't it? Isn't that the mask behind social media?
I think a lot of us are quite open now on social media when trainees talk about their struggles and things. I think we're a lot more open about people sort of saying, look, I'm struggling and things, actually. And I think I've done it at times where I've just said, I've had enough this week. So I think we're a bit better at it these days.
Med Twitter, it is very, very honest, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, to explain, you said about how I have two accounts. To explain that bit briefly, when I was doing stand-up, I set up my normal account in a bid to sort of meet other stand-ups and promote things. And then the second account came during the junior doctor strike when everyone and his dog wanted to be the face of the strike. And I came up with this fictional character called Samuel Bentley Smythe, who was this sort of fake public school educated beige trouser wearing orthopedic surgeon who he was going to be the face of the strike, and it sort of all went from there. And we were taking the mick out of how badly the BMA were doing it, and how it was all. And so that's sort of where it came from. And then it just, as the strike faded away and the joke wore off, it just became a sort of commentary on how grown adults can fall out over whether you should or shouldn't use lignocaine for blood gas or not.
Yeah. So you obviously enjoy it though, don't you? Right. So you tweet a lot, don't you?
I do. I mean, there's been times when I've thought I really need to not do this anymore. I mean, the most recent example was when I literally very innocently asked where a certain hospital was in London and was told by a consultant from that hospital that I was a bigot for not knowing about the socioeconomic poverty that goes on in that particular region. And I was that blew up out of nowhere. And it's funny. I enjoy commenting on other people's struggles rather than sort of getting involved in my own, I think.
Yeah. Well, it's not the first time we've used the word bigot on the Oral Apothecary, actually. So I don't know if you followed anything it's usually me that says it, but, there's this whole thing about single organologist and as a generalist. So what's your view on that? Because you're obviously working in one of the last bastions of holistic generalism, aren't you, in intensive care?
Well, I was quite lucky. As a house officer of F1, I did a job called clinical pharmacology, which sounds really grand, and it was basically just the general medicine that the specialties didn't want. So you ended up with this really interesting hodgepodge of patients who they just fell between all the stools. So it was meant to be, it was run by academic pharmacologists, and it was meant to be sort of drug reactions and overdoses and things. It was an interesting job because these were the patients that didn't neatly fit into any category. So you had this random hodgepodge of patients. And the nice thing about it was that every morning I could run through in my head, well, bed 1 is this and bed 2 is that and bed 3 is this. I know you shouldn't think of them as bed numbers, but when I did respiratory, it was like bed 1 is COPD, bed 2 is COPD, bed 3 is COPD. At least there was an exciting variation to it, even if a lot of it was quite troubling at times.
So clinical pharmacology then, Pete, you don't mention that in your bio anywhere.
It was a 3-month job. It was just one of the...
But you loved it, didn't you?
More than respiratory.
Well, that's not hard.
I'd gone from a urology job where you just literally did a quick ward round, booked some CTs, and then played table tennis and went to Starbucks, and then came back at sort of 3:30 for the post-op ward round. So then having this sort of quite high-pressure sort of medicine job where the patients have got delirium and mental health issues and they're all on various agents and trying to balance all of those things. And you had one professorial ward round a week. Yeah, that was a big jump.
I'm feeling a BBC series coming on, Pete.
Yeah, let's not go there, shall we?
Do you want to comment on that?
My biggest memory of that placement, a man who started eating his own poo as a protest, and the nurses just being like, Pete, you need to do something. Something's happening. And I was like, right, we'll go in. And I just saw this man eating it like a Snickers bar, and then immediately just ran into the sluice room and pushed a vomiting healthcare assistant out of the sink. Get out of my way. So there was no heroics or bravery in that job.
That's okay. We've covered the chocolate Bristol stool chart before on this podcast, so listeners are quite au fait with that. So I think what you're saying, though, is that the clinical pharmacology led you into this idea of intensivism because you get to look at the whole thing and you have to understand therapeutics and how different organs interfere with one another?
No, absolutely not.
Okay.
I was an obstetrician for a year after foundation training. So I really wanted to do obs and gynae. I intercalated, I did a research master's in uterine physiology, and I really enjoyed it. And I thought obstetrics was going to be my specialty, and I did it. But my last job as an F2 was HDU. And that's when I sort of realised that I really enjoyed critical care and multi-organ failure and trying to manage those different things as well. And then I went off to obstetrics and suddenly realised, what the hell have I done? This really is not for me. And in the back of my head was this critical care job that I'd done that I really enjoyed. And so I went back to it from there, really.
You thought it was going to hurt, didn't you?
We are not plugging his...
Not at all.
Steve never made it as a stand-up comedian, as you can tell. One thing I was going to say is so I used to tweet a lot, not with any sort of rhyme or reason, but I always found it awkward when some of those tweets would not necessarily come back to bite me in work, but someone in the real world, I suppose, would then start talking to you about something that you tweeted last night and almost expect a conversation about it. And I used to find it really awkward, and particularly in the workplace. Do the two worlds collide?
Occasionally. I mean, I've been really lucky that I've not had that thing where someone has said to me,
cancelled,
steady on, Pete. No, not quite, but I've not had that thing where like a consultant has said, steady on, Pete, you need to think about what you're doing here. And I know some people have had that sort of meeting without coffee experience. But I've been quite lucky that most of my bosses sort of get that it's a joke and they get that what I'm like, and I've got quite a sort of dark sense of humour. I was once, the university is over the road from one of the hospitals that I worked, and I parked in the university one day and I went to pay, and a student physician associate came up to me and went, "You're Pete Turton, the comedy doctor," off Twitter. and I suddenly felt this overwhelming sort of, oh God, I've got to be funny now. I've got to like think of something, like, and I just couldn't. I was just feeding coins into the machine, just hoping this moment would end. Just sort of being like, yeah, I'm not that funny in real life, and just ran for my car.
So we often ask our guests about whether, what's the one thing that you would say is on your agenda in relation to healthcare, not necessarily medicines, but was there anything that you wanted to bring to us?
If I may, there's two things. One, I've started paediatric ICU in the last 2 weeks, and you've just talked about fentanyl dosing and 15 and 50, and this is a whole new world to me, and the potential for error in paediatrics is
tenfold errors.
There's an error that's just happened on the pod. It was phenytoin.
Oh, we were wearing masks. We couldn't hear what he said properly.
It was phenytoin I was talking about rather than fentanyl. But no, I mean that's the whole point, isn't it? You're welcome, listeners.
My absolute terror at the moment of a nurse handing me a drug chart and going, "Can you prescribe anything?" Just being like, and having to, and it taking me 15 minutes. I had to prescribe some potassium for a child, and it took me 20 minutes, and then it turned out they had no central line after all that, so I had to go back to the drawing board. So I was like having triumphantly worked it all out, and I went, ta-da! And she went, yeah, we haven't got the right cannula for that. But no, in terms of other medicine things, I'm currently revising again for the final intensive care exam. You may or may not have seen this in social media. There was a bit of a fury because the last sitting of the exam had a 25% pass rate, where normally it's 65%. And there was an investigation into whether the exam had been conducted properly. And in the end, the investigation found, well, it just couldn't find a reason for anything, really. And so we're all back revising for it again. And there's a feeling of just sort of...
Was Boris Johnson involved?
I mean, some of the communication would be similar to that. But, I mean, even today, we all paid for the exam 4 weeks ago, expecting it to be an online sort of Zoom exam, and now it's been declared that we've all got to go to London for a day in April. It comes back to, again, what trainees talk about on Twitter, that as a trainee, where is the mutual respect at times? People, to make a broader point, people talk about their rotas not turning up, or people bullying them, or people saying the wrong thing, or being picked on, or whatever. We're adults, but we're very much infantilized at times, and it hits home when people are sort of saying, well, there's this exam, you've got to pass it, this is not negotiable, but we're going to change the rules of the game halfway through your revision, and there's nothing you can do about it. And I think that's a real frustration when I'm 37 now with 2 kids, a mortgage, and a dog that gets in the way of podcasts. And you do just think, what are we doing here? It's not a fun time to be a trainee, I think. And I think, but I think maybe it's always been like that. I just think on social media we're a lot more vocal about how upsetting it is.
Yeah. And maybe that's what social media's done, hasn't it? Is because you're sort of powerless in that position as well, aren't you?
Oh, absolutely.
Because you've got a goal, and you've got to put up with that crap to get to that goal. And I suppose because it happens to a similar but lesser extent in pharmacy, pharmacy, and it was a year or so ago, wasn't it, when there was I think it was during COVID, there was an absolute shambles with the exams, and students so with the pharmacy exam, your whole livelihood relies on that one date and that one exam. So for you at that moment in your life, it's the most important thing there is in the world. For other people, it's just an administrative thing that they can flip about with and do what they want with, and it's that lack of mutual respect, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. Well, at one point, when people were really upset about the low pass rate, certain people were tweeting, you need to think about the examiners and how upset they are right now. And